a forgotten depression, a colossal calamity, the worst economic collapse of the century. It was the work of a deliberately determined conspiracy, a conspiracy which originated in Wall Street, was organized from Wall Street, and was engineered by Wall Street. This is not 2008. This is the Panic of 1893, and it was the most infamous assault ever made by criminal men upon the public and private welfare of any people outside of actual war. Let's begin. This is episode 10 of the series, and we are exploring the darker side of the Columbian Exposition, the defining financial crash of the 19th century in American history. Yes, there were multiple. The question is, are these two events intertwined, or was this simply reckless banking that has riddled nations even to this very day? If ever an investigation is had, it will develop an infamy that will appall the people, and, as I hope, will move them to execute justice upon the national bank assassins who in 1893 did so much evil. These passages coming from Jacob W. Shuckers, with a publication printed in 1894 called The New York National Bank Presidents: Conspiracy Against Industry and Property, A History of the Panic of 1893, Its Organization and Methods. And what is being alleged within this specific publication is a criminal conspiracy between New York National and other bankers and certain federal officers, hereinafter named, which conspiracy had for its object deliberate extensive injury to the agriculture, the industry, the commerce, and the property of the American people, and to alarm and distress their minds by banking operations, with a view to coerce them and their representatives in Congress to a particular act, to wit, the repeal of the Silver Act of July 14th, 1890, which conspiracy was actually carried into effect with the result intended. So what is criminal conspiracy? Criminal conspiracy is a corrupt combination of two or more persons, or concerted action to commit a criminal or unlawful act, or an act not in itself criminal or unlawful, by criminal or unlawful means, or an act which would tend to prejudice the public in general, to subvert justice, disturb the peace, injure public trade, affect public health, or violate public property, or any act, however innocent, by means neither criminal nor unlawful, where the tendency of the object would be to wrongfully coerce or oppress either the public or an individual. And what is the Silver Act of 1890? Well, it was officially called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. It was a short-lived monetary policy that was highly contentious in the late 19th century. This actually goes back to the late 18th century, the Coinage Act of 1792, or also known as the Mint Act. The American monetary system was placed upon the foundation of this act as it provided standard units of currency. Copper, silver, and gold coins were specified by weight and their metallic composition, providing a baseline for ratios which led to simple conversions of currency and/or metals. There were subsequent acts which adjusted this ratio also. Linked below will be a publication called Causes of the Panic of 1893, and includes various chapters going into much more depth that could add nuance to an incredibly complex issue during this time. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 led to an undermining of the gold standard, as it required the US Treasury to purchase large amounts of silver every month, totaling to 4.5 million ounces. This led to not only domestic uneasiness but raised significant concerns with foreign investors. Were the United States committed to the gold standard? By creating an expansion of the money supply without proportionate gold reserves, it ultimately led to a panic. This was explored in more detail in the following passage from a wordy volume titled, "Why the Purchase Clause of the Act of July 14, 1890, called Sherman Law, should be repealed, and why free coinage of silver would be unjust." The world's measure of value. Their next reason for the free coinage of silver is of like character with the others, and it is that there is no pair of exchange between countries, that there is no world's price level for the commodities of commerce, that there is no world's or international measure of value. Therefore, this country can as well make silver bullion the measure of value as gold bullion, that the use of gold by other nations is a notion and our notions are as good for us to act on as their notions are for them. These wild assertions dispute every fact of the relation of money to the internal and external commerce of every country on the face of the earth. Again, the facts are the exact opposite of what the advocates of free coinage say is true. A grain of gold is now the par of exchange of every country in its internal commerce and between all countries of the world, and has been without a single exception for 100 years. Never in the history of the world has any coin of any nation been regarded. Everywhere it has been the single grain of gold. For 80 years, the money of account in exchange has been the aggregate of 113 grains of pure gold, called a pound, to ensure the full weight of 113 grains, which is coined in England as the sovereign. Not one of these pieces passes in its own country or anywhere else in buying commodities for the slightest percentage over its bullion value, and never has since the world began. Take a French 25 franc piece or an English sovereign or an American $5 gold piece into any shop in Brussels or the smallest hamlet in Germany, and they will give you the difference in its bullion value over the German 20-mark piece in change. Again, it is said there is not enough gold to do the business as measure of value money of the world. Here again they draw upon their imaginations for their facts. How do they know there is not enough? If there is any one thing in finance more certain than any other, it is that if every nation should make gold the money of account by making it the measure of value at 1 of gold to 28 of silver, the present price, and stop the free coinage of silver, stop issuing silver certificates, and then every government should thereafter buy and coin every silver piece of any denomination it could induce its people to use, as all European governments and the United States are now doing. While it would require some slight adjustment in national holdings of gold, it would not increase the world's demand for gold coin or increase or diminish the prices of a single commodity in any country by the smallest fraction. This publication being written by Joseph Henry Walker, American politician and businessman, while also being the chairman of the Committee on Banking and Currency. So was this act implemented with decent intentions? Making legal notes of tender that could be redeemable in either gold or silver coin to combat financial deflation that was affecting the Western United States. Let's explore another volume that focuses more on our exposition setting. The prosperity of the people of Illinois received a severe shock in 1893 when a general crisis interrupted the financial, commercial, and industrial development of the state. Probably in no state in the Union were the effects of this panic more far-reaching, and certainly in no city were they attended with more suffering than in Chicago. Any account of the industrial and financial progress of the state during this period must therefore begin with this event. The causes of the panic of 1893 were deep-seated and complex, and must be sought in national and even international events, running back at least as far as 1890. But back of all contributory factors lay the fundamental cause of all panics: unwise speculation. And in this the West shared largely. A decade of unexampled prosperity and expansion had tempted to unwise investment and extravagant expenditure. The storm had been sowed, and the whirlwind was now reaped. As the financial, commercial, and industrial development of Illinois had been especially rapid during the previous period, so now the people were called upon to pay in equal measure. The panic was precipitated, as is not uncommon in such events, by the failure of a few large institutions. In Chicago, the first shock came with the failure of the Chemical National Bank of that city, with a capital of $1 million, which closed its doors on May 9th, and was followed 2 days later by the Columbian National Bank of Chicago, with a similar capitalization. The smaller cities of the state were less affected than Chicago, though other failures which occurred during this month were those of the Evanston National Bank and the First National Bank of Kankakee, but the latter was restored to solvency before the end of the year. These suspensions were followed by the collapse of 3 private banks. On June 5th, there occurred a run upon a number of savings banks in Chicago, involving 8 state banks. In order to reassure the public as to the solvency of the state banks, the auditor at once ordered these institutions to furnish and publish statements of their condition on the morning of June 5th. These statements show that the banks were sound and prevented further spread of the panic at the time. In May, the panic became acute and spread over the whole country. The stock market experienced a severe crash in that month, but a more serious one occurred in July. Now, quick side, what happened in May of 1893? Anyone familiar with these episodes may know, and we will touch on this later. Keep that in mind. Money rates rose to abnormal heights, and many holders of securities were forced to unload at low prices. The situation was aggravated by the banking practice of the time, according to which the reserves of the country banks were heaped up in New York City. During the first 8 months of 1893, 24 banks other than national were reported by the comptroller to have failed in Illinois. No state banks, savings banks, or trust companies went down in this period. The result, wrote A.D. Noyes, was exactly what might have been foreseen. In the eastern cities, the use of loan certificates so far offset the violent shrinkage in reserves that between May 4th and July 12th, the loan account of the New York national banks actually increased. The loans of Philadelphia were cut down only 2%, and those of Boston only 4%. But Chicago, lacking the emergency provision of the Eastern clearinghouses, was forced to reduce its loans no less than 15%, in a city where local enterprises were already inflated by speculation incident to the World's Fair. The result of this contraction was a collapse more violent than that of any large commercial center. Not only were foreign exchanges interfered with, but the domestic exchanges were also thoroughly disorganized. Chicago packers and grain shippers announced one of the leading financial journals selling to interior eastern points, having been unable to sell their New York exchange, are ordering the currency to pay off for stuff shipped direct by express, thus doing away with banks. The effects of this crisis upon the industries of the country were soon evident. Railway gross earnings showed a loss for July and continued to register losses during the rest of the year. The general situation, which was typical of Illinois, was described as follows in the Chronicle. The month of August will long remain memorable as one of the most remarkable in our industrial history. Never before has there been such a sudden and striking cessation of industrial activity, nor was any section of the country exempt from the paralysis. Mills, factories, furnaces, mines, nearly everywhere shut down in large numbers, and commerce and enterprise were arrested in an extraordinary and unprecedented degree. The complete unsettlement of confidence and the derangement of our financial machinery, which made it almost impossible to obtain loans or sell domestic exchange, and which put money to a premium over checks, had the effect of stopping the wheels of industry and of contracting production and consumption within the narrowest limits, so that our internal trade was reduced to very small proportions. In fact, was brought almost to a standstill, and hundreds of thousands of men thrown out of employment. So let's remember, this is August of 1893, and again, the question is, what is occurring during this year, during this time? Utter standstills of commerce, industry, and finance. Another trustworthy index of the prosperity or depression of a period is the number of business failures. There was a 50% increase in the number of failures between 1892 and 1893, from 226 to 566 in the state of Illinois, which was about the same rate as in the country as a whole. Most of these failures occurred in mercantile and commercial enterprises rather than in manufacturing establishments. The crisis of 1893 was followed by a prolonged period of depression in the industrial, commercial, and financial world, which continued until 1898. The number of business failures continued to increase until they reached their climax in 1896. The year 1894 saw no such buoyant reaction from the panic of the previous year as was hoped might assert itself. Instead, it was filled with disturbing events which served only to deepen the gloom. Doubt as to the ability of the government to maintain the gold standard affected foreign trade adversely and halted business recovery at home. Another disturbing element was the necessity of reforming the tariff. All these general influences were felt in Illinois as elsewhere in the country. There were others, however, more local in their operation, which affected conditions in this state more directly. Manufacturers, menaced by the proposed reduction of import duties and a shrinking demand, curtailed production or in some instances closed their factories. The production of mines fell off, railway traffic and freight receipts declined, and new construction ceased. This meant a lessened demand for rails and structural iron, and the steel manufacturers reduced their output. Thus, a vicious cycle of lessened demand and reduced supply was created, which reacted severely upon the wage earners. With the failure of so many businesses, many persons were thrown out of work, and the problem of the unemployed soon became a serious one. Unemployed operatives crowded the streets of the cities demanding work or food, while other laborers from farm and mining districts flocked to the towns and added to the distress there. In no city was the suffering greater than in Chicago, where the boom period of the World's Fair had attracted a large number of workers, who were now left by the prostration of the city's industries without employment or the prospect of any. Thursday, April 27th, was Columbus Day, a bank and general holiday in New York. The day of the Great International Naval Review, at which Grover Cleveland and his cabinet were to be present. This was a peculiar day upon which the Secretary of the Treasury and the National Bank presidents were to meet, but a particularly convenient one for the purpose. The public exercises of the day being over, Mr. Carlyle was met at the Victoria Hotel by J. Edward Simmons. A carriage had been provided in which Simmons and Carlyle were driven to the private residence of George G. Williams, president of the Chemical National Bank, where 9 National Bank presidents were assembled as follows. George G. Williams, president of the Chemical National Bank. Edward H. Perkins, Jr., president of the Importers and Traders National Bank. Frederick D. Tappan, president of the Gallatin National Bank. This man has been described as the bank dictator of America. Pretentious title. James T. Woodward, president of the Hanover National Bank. Brighton Ives, president of the Western National Bank. Henry W. Cannon, president of the Chase National Bank; George S. Coe, president of the American Exchange National Bank; W. W. Sherman, president of the National Bank of Commerce; J. Edward Simmons, president of the Fourth National Bank; Conrad N. Jordan and Charles J. Kanda were also present. Carlyle and the National Bank presidents met each other with an effusive cordiality. There were mutual expressions of admiration and respect. The meeting was marked by the most cordial spirit on the part both of the secretary and the New York bankers. The National Bank presidents proposed an issue of bonds with a view, as they professed, to protect the public credit, of which it appears the National Bank presidents are the self-constituted particular custodians and guardians. But the National Bank presidents perfectly well know, when they met the secretary, that there was to be no issue of bonds, and their proposition for an issue was intended either as a blind for the public as to the motive of this conference, or because the New York National Bank presidents never come within earshot of a federal officer of any rank without an instant lunatic paroxysm for an issue of bonds. The subject matter really in hand was the repeal of the Silver Law, and he expressed his opposition to any use of the government credit that might prove an impediment to repeal. As to the Silver Law, Mr. Carlyle was sufficiently hostile to it to satisfy even the malignant National Bank presidents. He assailed it with great bitterness. There was apparently no evil in the body politic that he did not ascribe to the operation of that law. In fact, he denounced the whole body of the financial and currency laws and declared the necessity for their revision and reorganization, the beginning of which, he said, must be the early, unconditional, and absolute repeal of the Silver Law. The early and immediate unconditional repeal of the Silver Law had been a cry of the New York National Bank presidents, raised, coincidentally, with the passage of the law. There had been but little or no intermission in its repetition since. But the secretary now made a statement so alarming, so atrocious and incendiary that, if the National Bank presidents had been anything but what they were, men of the most reckless purposes, with whom the proposal to commit an infamous outrage upon the people was already familiar, they would have assailed him with indignant protests and denunciations. But the West and the South, according to the secretary, and as was the fact, were against the repeal of the Silver Law. They were so wedded to the use of silver that they would not consent to the repeal except in exchange for free coinage. Grover Cleveland would never consent to free coinage. He was unalterably opposed to free coinage, and was resolved upon the repeal of the Sherman Law with as little delay as possible. A practical demonstration to the businessmen of the South and the West of the injurious effects of that law upon their trade and finances might be necessary to convert the fanatics of that section to vote for the repeal, and Grover Cleveland had come to the conclusion that if the object lesson of a panic and the distress that monetary stringency would cause were necessary to secure the repeal, the administration would do nothing to prevent it or to allay alarm. It is not pretended that the foregoing were the exact words used by Mr. John G. Carlyle in his address to the National Bank presidents, but they convey very succinctly the substance of what he said, and in part at the least, those with respect to the object lesson of a panic are so nearly his words that to distinguish them would probably be difficult. By an object lesson was meant an attack by the New York National Bank presidents and their confederates by banking operations upon the industrial and commercial communities, and most particularly those of the South and West, with a design to disorganize credit, to explode banks, to shut down mills and factories, to bankrupt merchants, to produce, in short, by banking operations, so widespread and intolerable a state of business and social disorder and suffering among all classes, rich and poor, as to create pressure from every quarter for the repeal of the Silver Law, to which all these universal ills were to be systematically ascribed. This was the atrocious scheme of outrage and spoliation of the industrial, agricultural, and commercial communities wrapped up in the proposed infamous object lesson. Now, did any one of the 9 national bank presidents, or did Conrad N. Jordan or Charles J. Canda show the least sign of astonishment, alarm, distress, or even surprise when Mr. Carlyle made his astounding statement that a national bank war upon the national prosperity was approved by Grover Cleveland? No. Did any one of the 9 national bank presidents, or did either Conrad N. Jordan or Charles J. Canda make any protest, even the slightest, that a national bank war upon the industrial and commercial communities would be an outrage immeasurably wicked, cruel, indefensible, infamous, and criminal? No. Did any one of the 9 national bank presidents show or express any disinclination whatever to join in this proposed cruel, infamous, and criminal national bank war upon the industrial and commercial communities? No. On the contrary, the 9 national bank presidents and Misters Conrad N. Jordan and Charles J. Canda were at the Williams House Conference in the expectation that Mr. Carlyle would make, at least in the substance, precisely the delivery that he did make. The Secretary of the Treasury, the 9 national bank presidents, and Misters Conrad N. Jordan and Charles J. Canda were in perfect accord. They shook hands all around and separated as effusively as they had met. They understood each other perfectly. An immense calamity now impended over the American people. A calamity that was to break upon them within the next 48 hours. According to the banker's program, the projected object lesson was to begin in New York City, in the stock exchange. It did so begin, and those conditions of activity and confidence that had prevailed in the exchange at the close of business on the 26th of April, the 27th being a bank and general holiday, were wholly reversed within 48 hours after the Williams House meeting had adjourned. So immediately, so instantly, indeed, did the conspiring national bank presidents begin their work of outrage and ruin. But it was not until Monday, the 1st of May, 4 days after the Williams House meeting, that the Confederated bankers showed their infamous, brutal teeth in good earnest, when they made an attack upon the stock exchange prices that was kept up without relaxation for 5 successive days. Now, wait a minute. What other event was scheduled to begin on the 1st of May of 1893? A truly incredible coincidence, considering that only a few days prior, this was all brought together, let's say, on Columbus Day. Yet another strange coincidence. May 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th were days of a continuous, vindictive calling of loans, an extensive and merciless sacrifice of collaterals, and of heavy shrinkages in values, with resulting collapse and ruin to thousands of unfortunate borrowers. While these operations were going on in New York, the withdrawal and restriction of credits had begun and were going forward elsewhere, and by means of that subtle telegraphy that goes from bank to bank and from city to city, preparations for the great storm within 10 days extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The storm broke about the 9th of May by the sudden, unexpected explosion of several Western banks, and within 40 days thereafter, the national bank presidents and their confederates had created a state of universal excitement and consternation, a condition that illustrated at the same moment the enormous power of these national bank miscreants, their absolute control of the national banking institutions of the country, and the relentless, cold-blooded cruelty with which they put their power and control into action. The Columbian Exposition was advertised as the greatest exposition in the world, put together and hosted by a city that accumulated many accolades. However, it almost wasn't. Would it be another curious coincidence considering the final two cities that were vying for control of this extravagant display of national pride, presence, and prowess? The first World's Fair bill was introduced in the United States Senate by Senator Cullom of Illinois, December 19, 1889. January 11, 1890, DeWitt C. Krieger, then mayor of Chicago, Thomas B. Bryan, and Edward T. Jeffrey appeared before a special committee of the United States Senate and addressed the same in support of Chicago's application. It was at that meeting that Mr. Bryan experienced the satisfaction of defeating Chauncey M. Depew, who led the New York delegation. For this victory, Mr. Bryan was complimented by the entire press of the country outside of New York. How bitterly the battle was waged between East and West, all the world knows. Nothing that could influence the decision of Congress was left undone. Nothing that the press could contribute toward the settlement of the problem was left unwritten. It was, therefore, a signal endorsement of Chicago's persistency and pluck when, in the face of the opposition of the representatives of the Eastern interests, Congress voted, February 24, 1890, to have the exposition in Chicago. The Panic of 1893 does not appear to be mentioned in official documentation of the Columbian Exposition, and in all honesty, it makes sense. This would be marketing suicide, and the branding of the World Fair along with Chicago would be tarnished. However, was this part of the object lesson of the national bankers focused on Wall Street? The West had won the initial battle, temporarily. Yet the war was triggered on May 1st by the East, which seemingly had catastrophic consequences. How was the world's greatest event happening simultaneously while stock markets were crashing? Banks were imploding, businesses closing. The very act of bank runs or public panics, creating an increasingly worse situation, as sometimes even the rumors of a bank run could incite a panic by their very nature, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yet this was all happening while 27 million visitors passed through the entry gates of the Columbian Exposition, exploring the White City and its various treasures, venues, and entertainments. These two events ultimately intertwined so finely as to caress the strings of conspiracy that pulled together ever so tightly, so concisely that the Panic of 1893 was labeled the Forgotten Depression. Suppose it is easy to forget when you give them bread and circuses. History has ascribed two of our greater panics, those of 1837 and 1857, largely to reckless banking. So was reckless banking the cause of 1893? Suppose that one is for you to decide. However, this economic banking prowess continued and eventually led to another serious panic and depression in 1907. A final catalyst which created the foundation for a monetary system to alleviate all the woes and worries of the nation, creating a central banking system to address panics and create a stronger financial system within the United States. In 1913, it was created, the Federal Reserve. From this point onward, the monetary system has flourished while creating prosperity and peace in its wake.